Hello guys, I am the owner of Translano channel.
Welcome to Translano. Hey, there. I'm so glad you're here. This is a space where we celebrate self-expression, individuality, and empowerment. The first thing Nora saw was not the lace. It was the initials. The black strap had twisted itself around a wet white towel, and when she peeled it free under the buzzing laundry room light, the tiny stitch DM inside the band flashed up at her like a signature on a confession. The washer was still clicking through its last stubborn spin, thudding against the wall hard enough to rattle the detergent bottle, and there I stood with one hand on the doorframe, tasting metal in the back of my mouth, smelling hot cotton and lavender soap and that faint singe dust smell old dryers make when they've been working too hard. Nora did not raise her voice. That would have been easier. She held the brulette between two fingers as if it might change shape if she touched it wrong, and asked, almost gently, "How long were you planning to let me keep folding a man I didn't know?" Upstairs, a floorboard gave one small complaint where June turned over in her bed, and all I could think about was the yellow thread in that hidden seam. To explain why that thread mattered, I have to go back to the life I spent years pressing flat. Before all of that, before I became someone who sorted his own existence into piles marked safe and unsafe, I had a life that looked so ordinary from the outside it could have been printed on the side of a cereal box. I was 42, worked in the municipal archives on the lower floor of the downtown library, and spent most of my days in rooms that smelled like paper, dust, and old glue. I liked the steadiness of records. Birth certificates. City maps. Minutes from council meetings nobody remembered. I liked how even the messiest human events eventually got flattened into folders, labeled, and slid into acid-free boxes. That kind of order had always comforted me. It made the world seem less likely to break open without warning. Nora said I approached life the way some people approach loading a dishwasher, with too much thought and a private sense of righteousness. She said this with affection, usually while nudging me out of the kitchen so she could undo my geometric arrangements and put the bowls where bowls actually fit. She was an ICU nurse at St. Luke's, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of alarms and panicked relatives and somehow lower the temperature without saying much. She had dark hair that she twisted into a knot with a pencil when she was tired, a chipped blue mug she refused to throw away, and a habit of tapping her thumbnail against the handle when she wanted me to stop circling a point and say it plainly. "Use your words, not whether," she would tell me whenever I gave her one of my forecast answers. Not "I'm upset." Not "I'm worried." Just some cloudy with a chance of later. We had been married 11 years. We had a daughter named June who was 10 when the first crack opened and 11 on the night Nora found the laundry. June collected smooth stones from anywhere she went and kept them in her coat pockets, her backpack, the cup holder in my car, the bathroom windowsill, under sofa cushions. When I asked why, she always said the same thing, for luck, but practical. I never understood the practical part, but I liked the certainty with which she said it. She had Nora's direct stare and my tendency to go quiet when she was thinking. She also had a gap between her front teeth and a fierce loyalty that could make her seem much older than she was. If someone in her class sat alone, June sat with them. If a snail wandered onto the sidewalk after rain, she rerouted the entire family to avoid stepping on it. She cared with her whole body, shoulders first. My sister Celia lived 20 minutes away in a house so clean it made me stand straighter when I walked into it. She was a dental hygienist, widowed young, mother of twin boys who wore matching sneakers because she claimed it saved time. Celia had been my older sister in the most complete sense of the term since I was born. She had buttoned my school shirts when I was 5, edited my college essays when I was 17, and handled most of our mother's paperwork while I convinced myself I was helping emotionally, which is a beautiful phrase if what you mean is carrying one casserole and then needing a nap. Celia loved hard, judged fast, and carried a little silver peppermint tin that clicked open and shut whenever she was irritated. The clicking alone could shrink me back to 14. My father, Leonard, was a retired electrician who believed paper maps were morally superior to phones. He kept a state atlas in the glove compartment of a car he only drove to the hardware store and church, and whenever Nora teased him about it he'd pat the dashboard and say, "Road's a road." He was kind in the practical way some men of his generation were kind. He fixed things. He showed up. He built a bookshelf for June and learned exactly one joke about librarians for my sake, which he repeated every Thanksgiving as though it had aged into excellence. He was also the kind of man who could look directly at a complicated feeling and decide it was probably hunger. And then there was my mother, Rose, even after she was gone, because grief is not a clean departure. My mother had worked as a seamstress from home when I was a child. Not in the glamorous way the word suggests, nothing Parisian about it. She hemmed choir robes, let out bridesmaid dresses, repaired school uniforms, replaced zippers in winter coats, and put initials into the collars of shirts for families with too many children and not enough certainty about what belonged to whom. Her kitchen table was always a little dusted with thread. She wore a yellow metal thimble on her middle finger and bit the thread ends with small, decisive snaps. She taught me to sew because I hovered. That was how I learned most things as a child, by hovering until someone put a tool in my hand. If you make something, she would say, guiding my clumsy fingers through fabric, it asks less of you than if you pretend it made itself. I did not understand the wisdom in that until much later. Back then I only liked the order of stitches. In. Out. In. Out. Proof that two separate edges could be persuaded to hold. When Nora and I first married, we lived in an apartment above a bakery and slept through the sound of bread trays clattering at 4 in the morning because youth makes poor conditions feel quirky. We were not dramatic people. We made a life from modest ingredients and repeated effort. Saturday pancakes. Shared calendars on the fridge. June socks forever without partners. My archive boxes. Nora's impossible shifts. We argued about money sometimes, and once memorably about whether parsley was decorative or a real ingredient, but for the most part we had what I used to think of as a strong marriage and what I now think of as a practiced one. There is a difference. Strength can carry weight. Practice can hide strain if you get good enough at repeating the movement. If you had asked me then what my flaw was, I probably would have said something flattering in ugly clothing. I care too much. I think too hard. I try to protect everyone. The truth was less noble. I had a lifelong talent for avoiding the exact center of any difficult thing. I could talk around pain until it forgot its own name. I lied in small, tidy ways that seemed harmless at the time. I'm fine. Traffic was bad. I already ate. It didn't bother me. Give me a week and I could turn a feeling into a filing system nobody else knew how to open. The year before Nora found the laundry, my mother died after a long narrowing. Dementia did not take her in one dramatic swoop. It undid her by inches. First recipes, then dates, then my name on bad days, then the ability to trust her own hands. By the end she still remembered how to pinch a seam flat with her thumbnail, but not always what cloth was for. I went with Celia to clear out her apartment 6 days after the funeral. The place smelled like lavender sachets, dust, and that faint medicinal sweetness old buildings get when the heat has been too high all winter. Celia attacked the task with lists and contractor bags. I drifted. Every object seemed to contain a version of my mother I could not quite bear to throw away. In the bedroom closet, under a row of cardigans that still leaned toward her shape, there was a box of things too soft to be daily clothes. Slips. Camisoles. A pale robe with a missing button. Celia lifted one finger through a hanger and said, "Donate pile." Her voice was efficient, but her eyes were swollen. I said yes, but my hand stayed on a cream camisole for a moment longer than it needed to. The fabric was cool. Lighter than I expected. The strap had been repaired, neatly, in yellow thread I recognized from the tin on my mother's sewing table. I remember standing there with that little mend under my thumb and feeling something tighten at the base of my throat. Not desire, nothing like that, just the sudden ache of contact. An object she had touched. An object made to sit close to a body. Something hidden under ordinary clothes, doing invisible work. I put it in the donate pile. I want to be honest about that. I did not begin by stealing relics from the dead. I drove home afterward, ate reheated lasagna with Nora and June, and laughed at something absurd on television. But that repaired strap stayed with me. Not visually at first. physically. The memory of smooth fabric and yellow thread kept drifting into my mind when I was in the shower, when I waited at red lights, when I was half asleep. It was not a thought I welcomed.
So
It was
you
more like a pebble in my shoe I kept pretending would soften if I ignored
am
it.
able to
A week
make
later, I had my first panic
yes or
attack.
no?
That is the
Common.
clean version. The real version was messier because I did not know that was what it was while it was happening. Nora was on nights. June had gone to a friend's birthday sleepover, a pajama blur involving pizza and some animated movie she had already watched 12 times. I was alone in the house folding laundry in the basement because domestic tasks have always felt like proof I am useful when I cannot name what else I am. I remember the hum of the dehumidifier.
How you feel?
A pair of Nora's
and
scrubs
how
still
I
warm
feel.
from the dryer.
But
One
I
of
feel
June's
better.
socks turned inside out like a small surrender. Then my chest pulled tight, my fingers went numb, and the room started shrinking inward as if the concrete walls had suddenly remembered they were underground. I sat down on the cold floor between the washer and the shelf of detergent and convinced myself I was having a heart attack, which was laughable in hindsight because my first coherent response to possible death was annoyance at the state of the lint trap. It passed after maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Panic distorts clocks. By the time Nora called on her meal break, I had water in front of me and my voice arranged. Just tired, I said. Long day. Use your words, not weather, I heard in my head, and gave her weather anyway. The next day I went to work, catalogued a donation of zoning maps from the 70s, and felt as though I had left part of myself crouched on the basement floor with the dust bunnies. I did not tell Nora. I did not tell Celia. I did not tell my doctor for another 3 months. I did what I had always done. I got more careful. Less coffee. More sleep, in theory. More order. The anxiety came back anyway, quietly at first, then with enough regularity that I began structuring my life around not letting anyone notice. I took longer routes home because motion soothed me. I volunteered to do laundry because the repetitive folding helped. I stood in the bathroom with my palms on the sink until the dizziness passed and came out smiling at dinner like a man who had merely been considering toothpaste. The first step toward the life I later hid from my family happened on a Tuesday in October under fluorescent lighting so unkind it made everyone in the department store look recently exhumed. I had driven 20 miles to buy printer paper because our office budget was a practical joke and I used errands to give my thoughts somewhere else to go. On the way back I passed a store with a window display of winter things, scarves, slippers, soft undershirts on headless forms, and for reasons that would have embarrassed me to explain even to myself, I parked. I sat in the car for nearly 12 minutes. I know, because I watched the dashboard clock change and told myself I was about to leave every minute until I had run out of convincing tones of voice. My hands were on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 like a teenager at a driving test. I remember looking at a woman returning a shopping cart and thinking she probably had no idea that inside the silver hatchback beside her a middle-aged man was trying to decide whether touching a rack of clothes counted as a moral failure. I nearly laughed. There is a point at which your own secrecy starts to feel so theatrical it becomes absurd. I went in mostly to end the suspense. I did not march confidently toward anything. I wandered among towels first, then men's undershirts, then sleepwear, as if a department store were a border crossing and I needed to establish a plausible route.
Please
I picked up a plain
hit the
camisole from a
subscribe
rack
button,
because it looked almost like
click
nothing.
the like button,
No lace.
and
No decoration.
told me how
Soft gray cotton
it is
blend.
story.
The kind of thing that could pass for an undershirt if held by a sufficiently nervous man.
If
I put
you
it back.
want,
Picked it up
second
again.
part,
My
then I
face felt
told-
hot. The woman near me was comparing sizes, not looking at me at all, but I had the crawling sensation of being visible in a new and irreversible way. I bought the camisole, a pack of batteries I did not need, and a dish towel to make the bag look random, which remains one of the least convincing acts of espionage ever attempted. I hid the bag in the trunk until Nora left for work. Then I brought it inside like contraband and stood in the bathroom holding the camisole by its straps. There are decisions that feel huge because they are public, and then there are private ones that barely move the air in a room but rearrange your whole interior. Pulling that soft gray fabric over my head was one of those. I expected shame first, or relief, or some clear revelation with dramatic music behind it. What came instead was quiet. Not silence outside me. The refrigerator still hummed. A dog still barked 3 houses over. But inside me something stopped bracing. The fabric lay flat against my ribs under my shirt, light enough to forget if I stayed still and impossible to forget if I breathed deeply. I looked in the mirror and did not think, there, that is the real me. It was stranger than that. I thought, there you are, and I had no idea who I was addressing. That was the terrifying part. Not the garment. The recognition without vocabulary. I took it off after 20 minutes and folded it into the back of my sock drawer. Then I unfolded it and put it in a canvas tote in the basement. Then I moved it again to the cedar box that had held my mother's sewing things, because even in secrecy I wanted order. That night at dinner June told us about a classmate who had tried to glue googly eyes to a pumpkin, and I laughed at exactly the right places while my skin still remembered the gray cotton under my sweater. The first real consequence was not discovery. It was lying. Nora asked me a few days later why there was a charge from a department store in a town 20 miles away. It was on our bank app. We were not rich enough for invisible purchases. I heard myself say, printer paper. Batteries. Both technically true, which is the coward's favorite version of dishonesty. She nodded and moved on. I chewed my food too long and tasted cardboard. If it had stopped there, maybe I would have turned the whole experience into a strange footnote. Grief does odd things. Anxiety does odder ones. But I went back. Not often at first. Once a month, maybe. Then whenever the pressure in my chest began building in the car or under the archive lights or at 3 in the morning when I woke with my jaw clenched so tight my molars ached. I told myself it was a coping tool, a harmless private ritual, a borrowed language for comfort. All those things were partly true. The trouble with half-truths is that they become scaffolding if you lean on them long enough. I started buying pieces that were less neutral. A black one. A cream one. A pale blue one so soft it felt almost cool even in my hands. I learned more than I ever expected to know about fabric blends. I kept everything folded in tissue paper inside the cedar sewing box from my mother's apartment, beneath her shears and old pattern weights, as if the presence of those objects could make what I was doing legible. Sometimes I wore those things only in the basement after everyone was asleep, sitting on the old stool beside the washer while the spin cycle rattled through the house. Sometimes I wore them under my normal clothes on days when my thoughts felt too loud. The sensations were embarrassingly simple, shoulders dropping. Breath reaching lower. The static in my head lowering 1 notch. I hated how much I needed that. I hated how much it helped. Both could be true at once. That was the beginning of my education in contradiction. Around that time I met Tasha. The archives needed costume sketches digitized for a local theater company that had donated a set of old production files, and Tasha came down to review some materials because half the handwriting on the notes belonged to her former mentor. She owned an alterations and costume shop called Hemline 2 blocks from the library, had a shaved head, 3 gold hoops in one ear, and a measuring tape draped around her neck so often it might as well have been jewelry. She was the kind of person who made immediate eye contact and then did not waste it. Sympathetic, because she laughed from the belly and remembered June's name after hearing it once. Flawed, because she treated reinvention like a hobby everyone ought to try at least twice and had very little patience for people who needed time to approach their own lives. Impossible to forget because she wrote notes to herself on the backs of receipts and tucked paintbrushes into her bun when it was long enough, which somehow it never quite was. I do not mean I met Tasha and confided everything like a movie montage. I am not that efficient with my damage. We spoke first about theater records, then hems, then old machines. Weeks later I went into her shop with a shirt that needed a button replaced even though Nora could have done it in 3 minutes and I could have done it in 7. Tasha fixed it while talking about the architecture of clothes. People think clothes are decoration, she said, squinting at my shirt front. Mostly their permission. I must have made some face because she looked up and smiled in a way that made evasion feel visible. Not always, she added. Sometimes they're armor. Sometimes they're translation. That word stayed with me. Translation. Not disguise. Not costume.
Okay, dear,
Translation.
thanks for watching.
A month later, after
So,
3
this is
separate failed
amazing
attempts to
story.
adjust the strap on the cream
And
camisole myself, I brought it to Hemline in a bag that made my palms damp
now
all the
you
way
tell
there.
me, comment
Tasha took it out,
how is
examined the
it.
stitching, and said only, whoever
Thanks,
sewed these initials
dear.
knew what they were doing. I had added them by then. DM in yellow thread. My mother's habit. My hand. It made the garments feel less like foreign objects and more like things that belonged to my life, which in hindsight should have told me a great deal. I said I had done it myself. Tasha nodded as if I'd told her the weather, pinned the strap, and never once asked for a justification. That freedom felt so generous it almost made me angry. I wanted someone to either absolve me or condemn me. Her refusal to do either left me alone with myself. Celia, unsurprisingly, represented the opposite approach. She found a receipt from Hemline in the pocket of my coat when she borrowed it one cold afternoon after lunch at our father's. She held it up between 2 fingers while the twins chased each other around the backyard and asked why I needed an alterations shop when I could barely remember to mend a button. My answer was too quick. Her eyes narrowed. Celia had spent years reading mouths for cavities and lies. I do not recommend trying to fool her in either field. I did not confess. Not fully. I said I had been buying some clothes I hadn't told Nora about. I said I wasn't having an affair. I said I was under a lot of pressure. All true, all evasive. Celia snapped open her peppermint tin, snapped it shut, and said, "Be serious, Daniel." She always said my full name when she thought I was wasting oxygen. If there's something going on with you, you do not get to turn it into one of your quiet projects and hope the women in your life clean up afterward. It stung because it was accurate even without the missing specifics. Celia's flaw was that fear came out of her dressed as scorn.
Wow.
Her sympathy was that beneath every sharp thing she said was a frantic wish to keep the people she loved from wrecking themselves. Still, I left her house feeling flayed. June, though, saw more than either of us knew. I realized that months later, but the sign was there early if I had been willing to read it. One Saturday morning she came downstairs while I was in the basement sorting laundry. I had one of my hidden things draped over the drying rack because I thought she was still asleep and children at 10, I had decided, were incapable of appearing without warning only in stories. She stopped at the bottom step holding a science worksheet and looked at the pale blue strap hanging between one of Nora's cardigans and a pair of my undershirts. Her eyes moved from the rack to me and back again. "Is that yours?" she asked. The room went bright and flat around the edges. I said the worst possible thing. "It's for a costume project." June frowned, because there was no costume project and she had inherited her mother's allergy to nonsense, but she only said, "Oh," in a long, thoughtful way and handed me the worksheet for help with the life cycle of a frog. That should have been the moment I sat on the basement step and chose honesty over convenience. Instead, I helped label tadpole and froglet while my own pulse knocked at my throat like it wanted out. Later I found a smooth gray stone on top of the cedar box, no note, no explanation. For luck, but practical. She had seen enough to know something needed protecting. I had taught my daughter to protect my silence. That knowledge took a long time to catch up to me. By winter I was living in 2 realities so thoroughly that moving between them began to feel like changing postures. In one life I was Nora's husband, June's father, the archival man who came home with library dust on his cuffs and made lentil soup on Thursdays. In the other I was the keeper of a cedar box, a man whose breathing changed when certain fabrics lay against his skin, a person asking wordless questions in the mirror and then stepping away before he had to answer them. It was not glamorous. It was
How
exhausting.
many percent?
Secrecy has terrible posture. Everything in you leans. There were practical consequences. I became harder to reach even when I was physically present. Nora would ask if I could pick up milk and I'd say yes, without hearing the rest of the sentence. June once had to say "Dada" 3 times at dinner because I'd gotten stuck in the middle of nowhere wondering whether needing softness made me foolish or merely late to my own life. Nora asked if I was depressed. I said maybe a little. She asked if I wanted help finding a therapist. I said I'd think about it. She tapped the handle of the blue mug against the table, once, twice. "You are vanishing in front of me," she said. I told her work was busy. I told her my mother's death had hit me harder than I expected. I told her I was tired. All true. None enough. Then came the unexpected turn, the one I would not have predicted if someone had written my life on a whiteboard. Nora asked if I wanted to try for another baby. She asked it in the car after June's piano recital, of all places, while we were eating drive-thru fries in the parking lot because the restaurant was too crowded and June had fallen asleep in the back seat with her recital ribbon around her wrist like hospital ID. Rain stippled the windshield. The heater made the air smell faintly like old dust. Nora stared forward and said, not casually but carefully, "I've been thinking maybe our family doesn't feel finished to me." My whole body went cold, not because the idea was wrong but because it was beautiful and impossible in the state I was in. Another child meant more intimacy, more shared logistics, more trust, more future. I was already struggling to let my wife see the present. I sat there with a French fry halfway to my mouth and heard myself say something non-committal about timing. Nora nodded, too quickly. She must have felt the recoil. She turned toward the window and ate in silence while June snored softly in the back. That moment haunted me because it showed me, with no room for argument, that my secrecy was not merely private. It was already shaping other people's hopes. A week after that, Tasha asked if I was sleeping. I had gone to Hemline to pick up an altered piece and must have looked as wrecked as I felt. She handed me the bag, leaned on the counter, and said, "You've got that face people get when they're trying to carry a piano upstairs by themselves." I laughed harder than the line deserved. Then I almost cried, which was humiliating under fluorescent thread displays. Tasha reached for her measuring tape, not because she needed it but because handling objects was how she kept from crowding other people. "You don't have to solve the whole thing before you tell the truth," she said. "That's a trap. Freedom sounds lovely until someone offers it while you still have a mortgage and a child and a wife whose trust you have already dented." I nodded like a man collecting advice brochures in a waiting room. When the truth finally came out, it did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with laundry, because life enjoys a metaphor when it can get one cheaply. It had rained all day. The kind of narrow, steady rain that made the backyard look blurred and silver. Nora had gotten home early because her shift was cancelled. June was upstairs half-heartedly doing math and fully committed to not admitting she needed help with fractions. I was in the basement switching the wash when Nora came down carrying a basket of towels. She liked to batch chores when she had nervous energy, and I had been relying for months on the fact that our laundry routines rarely overlapped. The black bralette must have clung to the inside of a sheet and fallen free when she lifted the load. That is the banal mechanics of catastrophe. A static cling accident. She stared at the initials. DM yellow thread. My hand, my mother's lesson. The washer pounded. A drop of water slid from the strap to the concrete floor. Nora looked up at me and asked the question from the beginning of this story, and in the seconds after it landed I could hear everything except my own thinking. The dryer buzzed upstairs. A car door slammed somewhere outside. June laughed once at something in her room and the sound cut off when she remembered she was supposed to be miserable about fractions. "What is this?" Nora asked then, but quieter than before. Not because she did not know what object she was holding. Because she was asking which truth she had just stepped into. "Say it," I told myself. "Say the plain thing. Use your words." Instead I said, "It's mine." The sentence hung there like a coat with no body in it. Nora did not move. Since when? I could have chosen a clean line then. Months. Since my mother died. Since the panic started. I don't know what it means yet, but it's real. I could have offered her something solid enough to stand on. What I did was worse. I hesitated. Her eyes changed before her face did. How long has June known? That question hit with such precision that I actually took a step back. Nora had seen the gray stone on the cedar box months earlier and asked me about it once. I had said June was leaving treasures in odd places again. She had accepted that. Now she was adding it up faster than I could survive. One time, I said. She saw something one time. Nora set the basket down very carefully on top of the dryer. Towel. Towel. Bath mat. Her movements were so controlled it made the room feel dangerous. Did you lie to her too? Yes. The washer stopped. Just stopped. After all that pounding, the click into silence was worse than a shout. Nora sat on the bottom stair. She was still holding the bralette in one hand. I don't know what hurts first, she said, looking at the concrete floor instead of me. This? Or the fact that our daughter learned to keep your secrets before I knew there were secrets to keep. There are moments when your whole life offers itself up in one clear indictment. Not theatrical. Not cinematic. Just exact. That was mine. I wanted to defend myself with all the pieces that felt true from inside my own skin. I wanted to say I had been confused, panicked, ashamed, that none of this had anything to do with loving her less, that I was trying to protect our family from a question I couldn't even finish asking. But the protection I had offered was exclusion. She sat there in the smell of detergent and wet cotton, and for the first time I understood that secrecy does not merely hide information. It drafts other people into false realities and makes them live there. Do you want to be a woman? Nora asked eventually. I opened my mouth and closed it. My body had one answer, then another, then none. I don't know, I said. It was the truest sentence I had spoken and the least useful. Nora nodded once, very small. I can work with pain, she said. I can work with fear. I can even work with not knowing. I cannot work with being edited out of my own marriage. Then she stood, carried the basket upstairs without looking at me, and closed June's bedroom door behind her for the night with a click so soft it might have been mistaken for restraint. I sat on the stool beside the washer until the damp air cooled on my arms and my feet went numb in my shoes. The black strap lay on top of the dryer where she had left it, the yellow initials glaring up like they had been waiting for an audience. That was the breaking point, but collapse is not a single sound. It is the noises afterward. The cupboard Nora opened too quietly while making breakfast. June looking between us like a child watching weather roll in and trying to decide if the picnic is cancelled. My own voice, suddenly stiff and formal, asking if anyone wanted toast. The humiliating domesticity of a family entering crisis beside a jar of apricot jam. Nora did not leave that morning. She got June to school. She showered. She stood in the kitchen in clean jeans and her oldest sweater and said, "You need to tell me all of it. Not every thought you've ever had. But the facts. Today." So I did. Or tried. The panic attacks. The shopping. The box. The yellow thread. The basement. The lie to June. Tasha, though only as a tailor and the one person outside the family who had seen the clothes. My confusion. The relief. The shame. My mother's repaired strap in the closet after the funeral. I said the words in clumsy handfuls. Nora did not interrupt except once to ask, "Are you in love with someone else?" and once more to say, "Stop apologizing long enough to answer." I said no to the first and tried to obey the second. By the end my mouth felt flayed. Nora looked exhausted in a way I had only ever seen after double shifts. "Do you know who you are?" she asked. "No," I said. She pressed her thumb against the chip in her blue mug until the nail blanched. "That is honest," she said. "And I wish it had come sooner." I moved into my father's spare room 2 days later. Not because Nora threw me out. Because June needed one house where the air was not cracking, and Nora needed space in which every folded towel did not feel like evidence. Leonard made up the room with old golf sheets he had been saving for no reason anyone could identify. There was a lamp shaped like a lighthouse and a dresser that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. He did not ask for details the first night.
So
He set a bowl of stew in front of
I
me, slid a basket of bread
get
across
your
the table, and
understanding.
said, "Your sister says it's
See,
complicated." Then, after a pause, "Road's still a road." I laughed into my spoon, which saved me from having to speak for a moment. My father's love did not come wrapped in comprehension. He did not understand what the clothes meant, or what name to give the part of me that had come loose, but he understood that I was his son and also somehow no longer fitting easily into that sentence. He responded the only way he knew how. He replaced the dead bulb in my lamp. He bought my preferred cereal without comment. He left the atlas on the passenger seat when he drove me to my first therapy appointment as if maps might be of use. Therapy was not cinematic either. No single sentence blew the roof off. Dr. Salazar had an office with one overwatered plant and a box of tissues so aggressively available it seemed almost funny. I did not have a great opening line prepared, so I said, "My wife found some clothes in the laundry and I appear to have ruined my life." Dr. Salazar nodded as if I had reported ordinary weather and asked me what the clothes meant to me before they meant anything to anyone else. I hated the question because it was better than I wanted. Over weeks, then months, we worked in the slow and irritating way real help often works. We separated panic from identity where we could, grief from shame where we couldn't, and the need for certainty from the duty to tell the truth. I learned that I had spent most of my life performing reliability so convincingly that I had mistaken it for self-knowledge. I learned that hiding is not the same thing as privacy. I learned to say, out loud, "I don't know yet," without attaching a dissertation. The hardest conversation was with June. Nora and I decided to tell her together, in language that fit her age and did not make her responsible for our adult fracture. We sat at the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon while rain stitched itself down the window and June rotated a stone between both palms like she was warming it. Nora let me begin. That was a gift I did not deserve but needed. "I kept something secret," I said. My throat went dry immediately. I wore some clothes that I didn't tell Mom about, and when you asked me, I didn't tell you the truth either. I was confused and ashamed, and that hurt Mom and it hurt our family. June looked at Nora first, then at me. "Are you getting divorced?" Children are ruthless archivists. They skip straight to the record that matters. "We're figuring out what happens next," Nora said, which was honest and merciful at once. June's face did something I will never forget. She did not cry first. She got angry. "I knew it wasn't a costume," she said, and slapped the stone down on the table hard enough to make the salt shaker jump. "You're bad at costumes." I laughed. Nora laughed too, one startled burst, and then June started crying because the laugh had punctured the effort she was making to stay composed. I moved instinctively toward her and then stopped, not knowing if I had that right in the moment. June solved it by reaching for me anyway, furious and sobbing into my sweater. "You should have just said," she said into the wool. I hate when people act weird instead of just saying. Out of the mouths of children and all that. She loved me without understanding the shape of what I was telling her. That love was not uncomplicated. It shouldn't have been. She had questions I could not answer cleanly. Was I still Dad? Yes. Why those clothes? Because they felt important to me in a way I was still trying to understand. Did I want a different name? Not then. Did this mean I'd lied about other things? Sometimes, and I was sorry. She hated that answer. Good. She was supposed to. Trust should not bounce back like rubber. Celia's response to the full truth was, predictably, a mixture of alarm and accuracy. She drove over the day after June found out, stood in my father's kitchen with her peppermint tin clicking open and shut, and said, "I am trying very hard to separate the identity question from the secrecy question." This was, for Celia, essentially poetry. "I do not care what clothes you wear in your own life, Daniel. I care that Nora had to discover she was sharing a marriage with a locked room." She was right. She was also softer than she sounded. When she left, she put 3 containers of food in Leonard's fridge and a card for a couples therapist on the counter without comment. That was Celia all over, a criticism in one hand, a casserole in the other. Tasha, meanwhile, became one of the few people who could hold my confusion without treating it as either spectacle or emergency. When I told her Nora had found out, she closed the shop door, made terrible instant coffee, and said, "Okay. Then now you stop building your life around the worst case." Her flaw showed up there too. She underestimated collateral damage because she had spent years building a life whose center was self-definition, and I was standing in the rubble of one built around mutual reliance. Still, freedom has to enter a room somehow. Sometimes it comes wearing gold hoops and carrying a tape measure.
Okay, dear. Thanks
Nora
for
and I
watching.
started counseling.
So,
I
this
am
is
tempted to
amazing
summarize those
story.
months neatly, but that would be
And,
false. Some sessions felt useful.
Now you tell me
Some felt like
how-
emotional tax
how
audits.
is it?
Nora spoke with a clarity that made me admire and fear her at the same time. She said the clothes were not what broke her first. It was the daily intimacy of a life built on missing information. "I know how you take your tea," she said once, looking at the bookshelf behind the therapist instead of at me. "I know the exact face you make when there's cilantro in something unexpectedly. I know how you sleep with one foot outside the blanket. I thought I knew the private logic of your life. And maybe nobody knows anyone completely, but I did not realize I was married to a man who disappeared from himself without telling me. There is no clever answer to that." I said I was sorry until the words lost enamel. Then I learned to do something harder. I stopped reaching for absolution and started answering questions plainly. Yes, I had hidden purchases. No, there was no affair. Yes, June had seen something before the laundry night. No, I did not yet know whether the clothing was connected to being transgender, gender nonconforming, grief, or some braid of those things.
So,
Yes, I had liked how I felt in them. No, liking it did not mean I had loved Nora less.
amazing.
Yes, I understood that intent did not erase impact. No, I could not ask Nora to wait indefinitely in the doorway while I figured myself out. Growth, for me, did not look noble. It looked like repetition. Writing one true sentence in a notebook every morning before coffee. Today I miss my wife and still do not know if I want to be her husband forever in the same way. Today I am ashamed and that does not exempt me from honesty. Today I felt calmer in the blue camisole and more grief than peace in the black one. Today I wanted to lie when June asked if I was okay, and instead I said, "Not really, but I'm working on it." It looked like learning how panic moved through my body before it took over. Soles of my feet going cold. Vision narrowing. Jaw locking. It looked like walks along the river when I wanted to claw my way out of my own skin. Therapy. Less caffeine. More sleep, actually this time. Breathing exercises I had mocked in healthier years and now practiced in parked cars like a repentant cartoon. It also looked like practical accountability. Separate bank account for my personal spending. Full disclosure about purchases. No more hidden boxes. I took the cedar sewing box out of the spare room closet one afternoon and opened it on my father's guest bed. Inside were the carefully folded things I had treated like both medicine and crime scene. I expected the sight of them in daylight to answer something. Instead, I just felt tired. Not of them exactly. Of the double life required to keep them. I kept some. Donated others. Not because Nora asked me to erase myself. She didn't. Because I wanted fewer objects between me and whatever truth I was slowly assembling. One small moment stays with me from that period because it taught me more than any insightful sentence. June came to my father's house for dinner one Wednesday, backpack thumping against her narrow shoulders, and wandered into the guest room while I was putting away laundry. She looked at the neatly folded stack of my clothes, including 2 delicate items visible on purpose for the first time, and stood there with her head tilted. Then she said, "Okay," the way someone might say okay to a new shelf in the hallway. She picked up one of her stones from the dresser and set it on top of the folded stack. "For luck," she said, then added after a beat, "Still practical." That was her version of love. Not full understanding. Not approval as a grand statement. Presence.
How many percent?
Adaptation. Room. Nora and I did not repair our marriage in the old shape. I want to say that carefully because for a long time I treated any outcome short of reunion as proof of failure. But repair and restoration are not identical processes. Sometimes you restore a thing to what it was. Sometimes you admit what it was cannot survive intact and you learn a new use for the broken pieces. Nora and I spent a year moving from spousehood into something less named and more honest. We separated legally. We sold the house 2 springs later because staying there had turned every corner into a before and after slide. Nora rented a duplex near June's school. I took a small apartment above a florist, which meant my stairwell smelled faintly of soil and eucalyptus all year. We shared custody. We learned how to discuss schedules without dragging our old injuries into every text message. Some days we managed well. Some days we failed spectacularly and had to begin again. There was grief in that. There was also relief. The relief shamed me until I understood that ending a false version of intimacy can be merciful even when it hurts everyone involved. People asked, quietly and not quietly, for labels. Humans love boxes almost as much as archives do. Was I gay? No. Did I want to transition? I did not, though the question made me sit longer with the parts of myself I had once dismissed as impossible. Was I a crossdresser? The word felt too tidy and somehow too flimsy for the private tectonic shift I had lived through, though I understand why others might use it. In the end, the closest truth I found was also the least dramatic. I was a man who had built himself out of usefulness, restraint, and other people's comfort until I could no longer feel the edges of his own interior life, and certain clothes opened a door to softness, grief, gender, memory, and self-recognition all tangled together. I did not need a final verdict to stop lying about the existence of the door. I also had to reckon with my mother in all this. Not as a haunting symbol. As a real woman I had flattened after her death into a neat source of yellow thread and sorrow. In therapy I understood that part of what those garments held for me was proximity to the kind of tenderness my mother embodied without ever naming. She made invisible labor visible through touch. Hemming, mending, initials and collars, small acts that said bodies deserve care even where nobody sees it. I had inherited the hands and skipped the permission. Sewing my initials into my hidden clothes was not only about ownership. It was an argument with shame. My mother's lesson returning in a form she never could have predicted. If you make something, it asks less of you than if you pretend it made itself. I had made a secret life and then expected everyone around me to live inside its consequences. The sentence finally landed. The first time Nora came up to my apartment after the separation, she noticed the laundry basket in plain view beside the bedroom door. There was nothing theatrical about that either. Just an ordinary basket with ordinary clothes and, mixed among them, the pieces I no longer hid. She looked at it, then at me. I was braced for contempt, pity, some complicated expression I could spend days decoding. What she gave me instead was a tired kind of respect. "This is better," she said. Not happy. Not healed. Better. Because it was true. We were never who we had been before. That was gone. Trust, once cracked, does not come back as innocence. It comes back, if it comes back at all, as something slower and more deliberate. Nora and I built a kind of peace from scheduled honesty. If June had a hard question, we answered it. If I was attending a support group, Nora knew. If Nora started dating again, which she eventually did, she told me before June did, because neither of us wanted our daughter learning adulthood from omissions any longer. That hurt in its own specific way. I sat in my apartment afterward and stared at the chipped blue mug Nora had given me during the move because, "You like this one more than I do and also I'm tired of looking at it," and I laughed until I had to sit down because grief and absurdity often share a coat rack. I did not become wiser all at once. I still had bad habits. I still edited myself when embarrassed. I still wanted, under pressure, to present a solved version of my life so nobody would have to witness the messy middle. But now I noticed the impulse before it made all my choices for me. That is more than I used to have. Awareness is not glamorous. It is repetitive and often rude. Still, it is better than sleepwalking. Years have passed now. June is taller than Nora and wears my old sweaters with the sleeves shoved up. She still carries stones, though now they sit on her desk beside chemistry notes and half-finished sketches.
Hit the like button
Celia still
and
clicks that
follow
peppermint
me
tin like a warning
on
signal,
my
but she has learned to ask me how I'm doing without
comment.
sounding like she's subpoenaing
Come
me.
on, let's go.
Tasha moved her shop to a larger space and keeps trying to convince me to take a sewing class for people with emotional baggage and excellent top-stitching potential. Leonard still trusts paper maps more than satellites. Last month, he helped me hang shelves and called my apartment cozy, in the tone of a man discussing a mild but survivable illness. And that scene in the laundry room, the one I started with, still lives in me in full sensory detail. The buzzing light. The wet black strap. The yellow initials. Nora on the concrete floor, asking what had become of the marriage she thought she was standing inside. I return to that moment sometimes not to punish myself, but to remember the exact cost of waiting for certainty before
So you
offering honesty.
told me
When I first told the story to myself, I cast Nora as the person who found the evidence and me as the person whose truth was discovered.
comment.
Now I understand that the deeper fact is simpler and harder. She found the place where I had abandoned both of us to silence. What I did next in that room matters too. After the hesitation, after the failure, after the first clumsy answer and the one about June, there was a second moment I did not recognize at the time as important. Nora had set the basket down.
On camera.
The washer had stopped. My ears were full of blood
How
and
you
shame.
feel,
And she
and
said,
how I
"Then tell
feel.
me something real."
But I feel
So I
better.
did. I said, "I don't know exactly who I am in this yet. But these are mine. And I should have trusted you with that before tonight." It was not enough to save the marriage in the form I wanted. It was enough to begin telling the truth. That is who I am now, if I have to answer cleanly. I am a man who loved his wife and still hurt her. I am a father who taught his daughter, briefly and unfairly, to hold a secret she never should have carried, and then spent years earning back the right to be believed. I am the son of a woman who stitched initials into hidden seams and left me, by accident or inheritance, a way to understand that care and identity are often made of small repeated gestures. I am someone who no longer thinks peace comes from fitting perfectly inside a familiar outline. Peace, for me, turned out to be much less elegant. A basket in plain sight. A conversation before the panic becomes a lie.